4,400 products had to be recalled because of this. It was one of the largest outbreaks in U.S. history. So you asked about a risk-based safety plan. Well, a good HACCP plan identifies those risks, and I can say more about that later if you like, but I will say this, since we did have 1,900 pounds of PCA product in our warehouse, we had to destroy it, of course, and we had to conduct a recall of their products because some we roasted in high oleic sunflower oil and some we packaged as raw peanuts and with other raw nuts to make mixed nuts and other mixes. It took about 2 months to do that recall, to actually identify where everything went and get back what hadn't been sold. But that's an example of how a risk can really get out of hand. And one of the things that I worked with Dr. Snyder on was to identify whether or not the oil roast process we used was sufficient to kill salmonella. We piggybacked off an Almond Board of California validation study, which stated that almonds that are roasted in oil for 2 minutes or longer at 260 degrees is sufficient to achieve a 5-log salmonella kill. So I repeated that experiment using peanuts, wrote it up, submitted it to FDA, and they approved it. So we did not have to recall the roasted peanuts. But that's quite a bit of information on risk management and where it didn't go too right.
Well, Bill, your experience on both of those recalls brings out a couple of very important points. Number one, you developed a recall plan. You came, there was a 1-page document. How many pages did you finish with by the time you put your input into the existing plan?
Oh boy, with all the supporting documentation and standardized forms on company letterhead and things like that, I suppose it was probably in the neighborhood of 150 pages maybe. The actual recall program itself was no more than about 8 pages, but still, you have to have all the supporting documentation. If somebody calls in and says, well, I ate your mixed nuts and I got sick, you got to start asking them certain types of questions. And then you also examine your customer complaints, other ones that you've got, to see if there's any similarities. If you can identify a particular ingredient that might have caused the problem, assuming that it is a legitimate one, you might have to go back to the supplier. So there's a number of things that really have to be done when somebody claims they've gotten ill on a product.
Well, that's particularly interesting that you raised that. Those food safety managers that are out there in the industry practicing and that have a minimal plan, upon this experience, would you suggest them going back and reviewing their programs?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, let's face it, we live in a world that is full of risk. Nobody ever thinks about it, but you can break your ankle getting on a bed. It doesn't happen very often, but it has happened, and the odds against it are pretty steep, but they aren't zero. Any statistician will tell you there is no such thing as zero. So what we can do in terms of food safety and food quality is keep improving things to the point where the likelihood of someone getting ill or even breaking a tooth on foreign material is so slight that it won't be non-existent, but it won't happen very often. And unfortunately, if you look at the if you look at the FDA's and USDA's recall pages and e-food alerts, you'd think that recalls are happening constantly to every company in the business. There are a lot of them, but the trend is downward for the most part on most of them. But when they happen, particularly those involving organisms such as Salmonella or Listeria or E. coli 015787, the consequences can be very devastating. Matter of fact, there was a dance instructor from St. Cloud, about 75 miles north of Minneapolis here, who became paralyzed and will have to be on some sort of health management system for the rest of her life after consuming E. coli 015787 contaminated ground beef from a major meat company.
Well, Bill, you also raised another fascinating point that you indicated in your experience. It was a good idea if your facility is ever audited by government agents and they collect samples, to also collect shadow samples. Can you illuminate on that?
Oh, certainly. That simply means you sample the same area they did. Now, what could be a result is it is technically possible that they could pick up the organism they're sampling for, Salmonella, Listeria, whatever, and you could not because they got all that was there. It probably doesn't happen very often, but in both cases that I cited in our facility where MDA came in to sample for Salmonella in the fresh cut area, and FDA came in and took 110 environmental samples looking for Salmonella after the PCA outbreak. We took shadow samples in all cases, and both the regulatory agency and our samples turned out negative. So it's a very good idea, and any company lawyer will advise you to do the same thing.
So, Bill, you finally, in this section, you mentioned that you had submitted a protocol after conducting your own experimentation and essentially piggybacking off a similar industry's sterilization or firewall, and then submitted that to the FDA. Can you review that briefly again?
Oh, certainly. It's not a sterilization. Perhaps I should go into some definitions here. Sanitization is the destruction of any organisms that can make you sick on a food contact surface. Disinfection is destruction of any organism on a non-food contact surface. Commercial sterility, which is a term that's used for canned goods, isn't sterility at all, but it is the elimination of organisms that survive the canning process that can make you sick. Total sterility is the absence of all microorganism life. Now, what you mentioned was the Almond Board of California. I can go into some detail on this. There were, in fact, a couple of Salmonella outbreaks on raw almonds, I believe in 2000 or 2001 and 2005. And if my understanding is correct, it was the Almond Board of California that actually petitioned the FDA to require all domestic almonds to be pasteurized. Well, okay, well and good. There's two ways to do that. There is steam pasteurization, which is what most people mean when they talk about pasteurization using heat, or cold pasteurization, which is what USDA terms it. This uses a chemical called propylene oxide, which happens to be, or used to be, an ingredient in dragster fuels. It's also used to make thermobaric bombs, and it happens to be toxic. And if you look at an MSDS sheet for this stuff,